The smallest act of honesty can awaken a promise that time never erased. Rain drifted softly across the streets of downtown Boston as 23-year-old Grace Bennett finished stacking the last row of used books inside the quiet bookstore cafe where she worked every afternoon after community college classes. The little bell above the front door rang one final time as the last customer hurried outside, disappearing beneath a black umbrella before the evening storm grew heavier. Grace smiled politely, locked the door behind him, and began her usual closing routine. She wiped the wooden tables, collected empty coffee cups, straightened the shelves, and quietly enjoyed the peaceful silence that always settled over the store after closing. It was the one part of every day that belonged entirely to her. Life had never offered many luxuries, but small moments of calm always felt like enough. As she reached beneath a corner table to retrieve a forgotten napkin, something reflected the warm light from the hanging lamps above. She knelt and discovered an elegant platinum ring resting against the leg of the chair. It was heavier than any ring she had ever held, engraved with delicate initials inside the band, and set with a single deep blue sapphire that seemed almost untouched by time. Grace looked around the empty cafe, even though she already knew the owner had gone. Without hesitation, she carried the ring to the front counter and searched the reservation receipts from earlier that afternoon, hoping to identify the customer who had been sitting at that table. Nothing helped. She sighed quietly before noticing a dark leather card holder tucked beneath the edge of the same chair where she had found the ring. It must have slipped from the customer's coat pocket without anyone noticing. She carefully opened it, expecting nothing more than a business card or driver's license. Instead, she found only a sleek silver business card bearing the name Ethan Montgomery and the address of Montgomery Holdings. There was no personal identification inside, only a few neatly folded notes and empty card slots. Grace immediately decided she would return both items the following morning. As she reached into her canvas shoulder bag to keep everything together safely, she removed the small envelope she always carried. Inside rested the only photograph she still owned of her late mother. The edges had become worn after years of careful handling, but the smile on her mother's face remained as warm as Grace remembered. Whenever life felt uncertain, she carried that picture because it reminded her that kindness never depended on wealth. She glanced at it for only a second before sliding it back into the envelope. Distracted by the rain tapping against the front windows, she unknowingly placed the photograph inside the same protective sleeve holding the business card and the ring before sealing everything together. She never realized the mistake. Outside, thunder rolled quietly over the city while Grace locked the bookstore and tucked the envelope securely into her bag. Across town, inside the glass headquarters of Montgomery Holdings, Ethan Montgomery ended another demanding day surrounded by contracts, meetings, and responsibilities that never seemed to end. The platinum ring had belonged to his family for generations, and although its financial value was extraordinary, its emotional meaning mattered far more. He had not yet noticed it was missing. Meanwhile, Grace boarded a nearly empty city bus, completely unaware that one forgotten ring and one misplaced photograph were already traveling toward a meeting that would reopen a chapter of history neither of them believed could ever return. The following morning arrived wrapped in pale sunlight that slowly washed away the rain from the night before. Grace stepped off the city bus carrying her worn canvas bag, carefully protecting the sealed envelope tucked safely inside. She had considered mailing the ring, but something about it felt too important to trust to chance. If someone had lost something carrying that much meaning, she wanted to place it directly into its owner's hands. The headquarters of Montgomery Holdings stood above the surrounding buildings, its glass exterior reflecting the bright Boston sky. Grace paused for only a moment before walking through the revolving doors into the spacious lobby. Polished marble floors, quiet conversations, and the steady rhythm of elevators created an atmosphere completely different from the little bookstore cafe where she spent most of her days. She approached the reception desk with a polite smile. "Good morning," she said. "I found something yesterday that belongs to Mr. Ethan Montgomery. I was hoping someone could return it to him." The receptionist looked down at the elegant envelope before glancing back at Grace. "May I ask your name?" "Grace Bennett." The receptionist made a brief phone call before smiling warmly. "Mr. Montgomery is between meetings. He said he would like to thank you personally if you have a few minutes." Grace felt slightly nervous, but nodded. A few moments later, an executive assistant escorted her toward a quiet conference room overlooking the city. Grace sat patiently near the window, gently holding the envelope with both hands. Across the hallway, Ethan finished a discussion with two senior executives before entering the room with his usual calm confidence. At 39, he carried himself with quiet professionalism rather than arrogance. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, but his expression remained approachable as he extended his hand. "Ms. Bennett, thank you for coming all this way." Grace stood and shook his hand politely. "I believe these belong to you." She placed the sealed envelope on the table between them. Ethan carefully opened it. The moment he saw the platinum ring resting inside, genuine relief crossed his face. He picked it up slowly, turning the familiar sapphire beneath the morning light. "I cannot thank you enough," he said sincerely. "This ring has been in my family for generations." Grace smiled. "I was just happy I found it before someone else did." Ethan reached into his wallet, clearly intending to offer a reward, but Grace gently raised one hand before he could speak. "Please do not misunderstand," she said kindly. "I did not bring it back because I expected anything in return." Ethan paused, studying her expression. There was no hesitation in her voice, only quiet honesty. He slowly placed his wallet back into his jacket pocket with a respectful nod. "Then at least allow me to thank you properly." As Grace gathered the empty protective sleeve from the table, a small photograph slipped silently onto the polished wood floor. Neither of them noticed it at first. Grace bent down to retrieve it, but the photograph landed face up beneath the sunlight streaming through the conference room windows. Ethan's eyes fell upon the smiling young woman captured in the faded picture. His hand stopped moving. The color quietly disappeared from his face. He stared at the photograph without blinking, as though the room itself had suddenly fallen silent. Grace looked at him in confusion, unaware that the woman in the picture was about to unlock a memory Ethan had spent more than 2 decades believing he would never see again. Grace quickly picked up the photograph with gentle hands, but before she could slide it back into the envelope, she noticed Ethan was no longer looking at the ring. His eyes remained fixed on the faded picture as though every sound inside the conference room had disappeared. The confident composure that had defined him only moments earlier had quietly dissolved into stunned silence. Grace looked at him with growing concern. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. Ethan did not answer immediately. His breathing slowed as memories he had carefully buried for more than 20 years rose with startling clarity. He recognized the smile in the photograph instantly. Time had faded the paper, but it had never erased her face from his memory. Finally, he spoke almost in a whisper. "Where did you get this photograph?" Grace looked down at the picture before answering. "It is my mother." Ethan slowly lowered himself into the nearest chair, unable to hide the emotion that crossed his face. "Your mother," he repeated quietly, as though saying the words aloud made them even harder to believe. Grace nodded. Her name was Caroline Bennett. The moment she spoke the name, Ethan closed his eyes for only a second. He remembered a rainy autumn afternoon 23 years earlier, when he had been a frightened college student carrying more debt than hope. He remembered standing outside a neighborhood jewelry store, staring through the window because he knew he could not afford another semester of tuition. He remembered a young woman with warm eyes and an easy smile stepping beside him and asking why someone so young looked ready to give up on the future. Caroline had been a stranger then. She listened without judgment while Ethan explained that he was preparing to leave school because he could not pay the final tuition balance before the deadline. She never offered empty encouragement. Instead, she simply told him to wait there for a few minutes. Ethan had expected nothing more than kind words. Nearly half an hour later, she returned holding an envelope containing enough money to cover the remaining tuition payment. She refused to explain where it had come from. She only smiled and said, "Promise me that if life ever gives you more than you need, you will become the reason someone else keeps believing." Ethan had tried desperately to repay her, but Caroline disappeared before he could even learn where she lived. For years he searched without success. The only clue he ever found was a receipt showing that someone had temporarily sold an engagement ring at a nearby jewelry shop on the very same afternoon she had helped him. Months later, after receiving his first scholarship and finding part-time work, Ethan returned to the store and quietly bought the ring back. The jeweler told him the young woman had never returned to claim it. Ethan kept the ring safely ever since, hoping that one day he might discover the person whose kindness had changed everything. Grace listened carefully without interrupting. The story sounded almost impossible, yet every detail carried the unmistakable weight of genuine memory. She looked again at the photograph in her hands. Her mother had never spoken about selling an engagement ring. She had never mentioned helping a struggling student or making a promise that would echo across decades. To Grace, Caroline had simply been a loving mother who worked hard, smiled often, and never talked about her own sacrifices. Ethan looked toward the photograph once more, his voice steady but filled with quiet gratitude. If your mother is the woman I remember, then every opportunity one have ever created began because she believed in a frightened young man before he believed in himself. Grace lowered her eyes, overwhelmed by a truth she had never imagined could be hidden inside one faded photograph and one lost family ring. Grace left Montgomery Holdings carrying the photograph more carefully than ever before. The familiar streets of Boston looked unchanged, yet every passing building seemed strangely different now that she knew her mother had lived a chapter of life she had never shared with anyone. Throughout the bus ride home, she replayed Ethan's story again and again, searching her memories for even the smallest clue that Caroline Bennett had once helped a struggling college student. Nothing came. Her mother had never spoken about selling an engagement ring. She had never mentioned a young man named Ethan Montgomery. She had simply worked long hours, laughed easily, and always insisted that kindness should never become something people kept score of. That evening, Grace unlocked the small apartment she had inherited after her mother's passing. It contained little of financial value, but every room still carried traces of Caroline's quiet presence. A knitted blanket rested across the old sofa exactly where she had left it months earlier. A ceramic mug remained on the kitchen shelf beside a collection of well-loved novels. Grace placed the photograph gently on the dining table before opening the wooden cabinet where her mother had stored family keepsakes. She searched carefully through neatly labeled folders, birthday cards, school certificates, and holiday photographs, hoping to find something connected to the story Ethan had told her. Hours passed. She found nothing about an engagement ring or a college student whose future had depended on one extraordinary act of generosity. Across the city, Ethan sat alone inside his office long after the building had emptied. The sapphire ring rested quietly on his desk beside the faded memory that had unexpectedly returned to life that morning. For years he had accepted that he would never learn what became of Caroline Bennett. Now he knew she had built a family, raised a daughter, and somehow carried her greatest sacrifice without ever asking for recognition. That realization filled him with equal parts gratitude and regret. He pressed the intercom button on his desk. "Rebecca, are you still here?" A moment later, his executive assistant stepped into the office carrying her notebook. "Yes, Mr. Montgomery." Ethan hesitated before speaking. "I need your help locating public records related to Caroline Bennett and her family. Please use only information that is legally available. I do not want anyone contacted, and I do not want Ms. Bennett to feel that her privacy has been disturbed." Rebecca nodded respectfully. "I understand." The following afternoon, she returned with a slim folder. "Everything came from public records," she explained. Ethan opened the file slowly. Caroline Bennett had passed away 5 years earlier after a long illness. Grace had been 23 when she became the sole occupant of the small apartment where she still lived. She worked 2 part-time jobs while attending community college, had no criminal record, no outstanding legal disputes, and had quietly volunteered at a neighborhood literacy program every Saturday for nearly 3 years. Ethan closed the folder without saying a word. Every page seemed to confirm the same truth. Grace had inherited far more than her mother's smile. She had inherited her character. Meanwhile, completely unaware that anyone had been researching publicly available information about her family, Grace discovered one final unopened box tucked behind an old bookshelf while cleaning the apartment that weekend. The wooden lid was covered with a thin layer of dust, and a small brass clasp held it shut. She brushed the dust away with gentle fingers before lifting the lid just enough to glimpse several carefully folded envelopes tied together with a faded blue ribbon. Resting beside them was an aged jewelry receipt bearing a date from 23 years earlier. Grace's heartbeat quietly quickened as she realized she had finally uncovered something her mother had never intended to throw away. And for the first time, she wondered whether the greatest part of Caroline Bennett's story had been waiting patiently inside that forgotten box all along. Grace carried the small wooden box to the dining table and sat quietly beneath the warm light that her mother had always insisted made every room feel more welcoming. For several moments, she simply looked at the faded blue ribbon wrapped carefully around the stack of envelopes. Caroline had always been an organized woman. Every birthday card, school report, and family photograph had been stored with gentle care. If these letters had remained hidden for more than 2 decades, Grace believed there had to be a reason. She slowly untied the ribbon and unfolded the first envelope. The paper had yellowed with age, but her mother's handwriting remained beautifully clear. It was not addressed to anyone by name. Instead, the first sentence simply read, "If kindness ever returns to my door, I hope it arrives as hope for someone else." Grace paused, feeling a quiet ache inside her chest before continuing. Caroline explained that she had never regretted selling her engagement ring because some decisions were too important to measure by money alone. She wrote that a young college student had been standing at the edge of abandoning his education, not because he lacked ability, but because life had briefly become heavier than opportunity. Caroline admitted she had recognized the same hopeless expression in his eyes that she had once seen in her own father many years earlier. She believed no dream should disappear simply because one difficult season arrived too soon. Grace reached for the aged jewelry receipt resting beside the letters. The date matched the very afternoon Ethan had described. Her hands trembled slightly as the scattered pieces of the story slowly fit together. The next envelope contained a folded receipt from the neighborhood jewelry store confirming the temporary sale of an engagement ring with a handwritten note across the bottom. "Keep this safe. One day, perhaps someone will smile because of it." Grace wiped away a quiet tear before opening the final letter. This one had clearly never been mailed. Across town, Ethan unlocked an old fireproof cabinet inside his private office after everyone else had gone home. Hidden inside was a small cedar box he had not opened in years. Carefully lifting the lid, he found the original jewelry receipt he had received when he quietly purchased Caroline's ring back months after graduating. Beneath it rested a single handwritten note he had carried through every promotion, every business success, and every difficult decision. The paper contained only one sentence written in Caroline's handwriting. "Promise me you will become someone's second chance." Ethan gently closed his eyes. That promise had quietly shaped the culture of his entire company, without most employees ever knowing why. He suddenly realized Grace deserved to know everything that remained hidden. The following morning, he called Grace and asked whether she would be willing to meet him one more time. His voice remained calm, but there was unmistakable sincerity behind every word. Grace agreed without hesitation. Later that afternoon, they met in a quiet public garden overlooking the Charles River, where autumn leaves drifted gently across the walking paths beneath tall maple trees. Ethan carried the cedar box while Grace brought the letters she had discovered only hours earlier. Neither of them spoke immediately. They simply exchanged the boxes in silence, each realizing they were holding different halves of the same story. As Grace carefully unfolded the final unfinished letter, Ethan looked toward the river and quietly said, "I think your mother spent 23 years protecting both of us from believing anyone owed her a debt. Today, I believe she finally wants us to understand what she was truly trying to leave behind." Grace carefully unfolded the unfinished letter while the afternoon breeze carried a few golden leaves across the quiet riverside path. Her mother's handwriting flowed gently across the page, steady and graceful until the final sentence where the ink suddenly stopped, as though life itself had interrupted the words before they could be completed. She began reading aloud. "If you are reading this someday, then perhaps kindness has finally found its way back. I never believed people should spend their lives trying to repay me. I only hoped they would remember that every act of compassion should become another beginning instead of an ending." Grace paused, swallowing quietly before continuing. "The young man I met outside the jewelry store believed he had reached the end of his future. I only reminded him that tomorrow sometimes arrives through another person's courage. If he ever succeeds, I hope he never looks for me. I hope he simply becomes the reason someone else refuses to give up." Grace lowered the letter into her lap. Neither of them spoke for several moments. The silence between them felt peaceful rather than uncomfortable, filled with everything Caroline had never asked to receive in return. Ethan finally opened the cedar box resting beside him. Inside lay the original jewelry receipt, carefully preserved beneath a sheet of protective paper, along with the engagement ring Caroline had unknowingly allowed to shape the course of his entire life. He gently lifted the ring into the sunlight before placing it back inside the box. "I spent years believing I owed your mother everything," he said softly. "Now I understand that she never wanted repayment. She wanted continuity." Grace looked toward the slow-moving river. "She was always telling me that kindness only matters when it keeps traveling." Ethan smiled faintly. "That sounds exactly like her." He then reached into the cedar box one final time and removed a folded document. "There is something else you deserve to see." Grace accepted the paper with quiet curiosity. It was the original proposal Ethan had written nearly 10 years earlier when Montgomery Holdings created its Employee Education Foundation. Across the first page, above every financial projection and business plan, appeared one handwritten sentence. "Built in honor of the stranger who believed in me before success ever did." Grace looked up, surprised. Ethan nodded. "No one ever knew who inspired it. I never even knew her full story until you walked into my office." Grace smiled through grateful eyes. "Then she has been helping people for much longer than either of us realized." Ethan looked across the water before speaking again. "I would like to establish a scholarship using her full name, but only if you believe she would have wanted that." Grace considered the question carefully. She remembered every lesson her mother had quietly lived rather than preached. Caroline had never sought recognition. She had simply believed that hope should multiply. Grace answered with calm certainty. She would never want people to admire her. She would want them to help the next person. Ethan nodded slowly. "Then the scholarship will ask every recipient to mentor someone else when they are able. That way her kindness continues without ever ending." Grace folded the letter carefully and returned it to the envelope. For the first time since losing her mother, the unanswered questions that had quietly followed her for years no longer felt heavy. They had become something warmer. They had become a living legacy. As the afternoon sunlight settled across the river, both of them understood that Caroline Bennett had never disappeared from the world. She had simply continued living inside every opportunity created by one compassionate decision made more than 2 decades earlier, and that quiet chain of hope was only beginning its next chapter. Several weeks passed, and the quiet promise born beside the Charles River began taking shape in ways neither Grace nor Ethan had imagined. Every morning, Grace continued opening the small bookstore cafe before the first customers arrived, shelving worn novels, preparing fresh coffee, and greeting strangers with the same quiet warmth her mother had always shown. Nothing about her daily routine changed because of what she had learned. She still rode the city bus. She still balanced college assignments after work. She still believed that dignity was measured by character rather than circumstance. One rainy afternoon, Ethan visited the bookstore without announcing himself. He wore a simple navy coat instead of a business suit, hoping not to attract attention. Grace looked up from arranging books and smiled naturally. "I did not expect to see you here." Ethan returned the smile. "Neither did I. I simply wanted to know where Caroline spent some of her happiest moments." Grace looked around the cozy shop with its wooden shelves, warm lights, and familiar scent of old pages. She loved this place. She believed every book carried someone else's courage. Ethan slowly walked through the aisles, stopping beside a small reading corner where children gathered every Saturday morning. Grace explained that her mother had volunteered there for years, reading stories to families who could not always afford to buy books. Ethan listened quietly, realizing that Caroline's generosity had never depended on grand gestures. It had always lived inside ordinary moments. Before leaving, he handed Grace a neatly organized folder. "These are copies of every letter and receipt connected to your mother that I kept over the years. The originals belong with me because they remind me where my journey began, but these copies belong with you because they complete your family's story." Grace accepted the folder with both hands. "Thank you. This means more than you know." Ethan hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "There is one more thing I would like to ask." Grace waited patiently. "The scholarship committee would like someone to help interview future applicants. I cannot think of anyone better than the daughter of the woman who inspired it." Grace looked surprised. "I am not an executive." Ethan smiled gently. "That is exactly why your perspective matters. We already have people who understand business. We need someone who understands hope. Grace considered his words carefully before answering. If I accept, I want every applicant to be treated fairly. No special preferences. No stories chosen because they sound dramatic. Ethan nodded immediately. That was always my intention. Their first scholarship interviews took place 2 months later inside a modest conference room rather than a grand ballroom. Students from different neighborhoods arrived carrying resumes, recommendation letters, and dreams that often looked larger than their bank accounts. Grace listened to every story with careful attention, remembering how one unexpected act of honesty had completely changed her own understanding of the past. During a short break, Ethan watched through the glass wall as Grace encouraged a nervous applicant who believed he was not qualified enough to apply. She never promised success. She simply reminded him to believe in the value of showing up prepared. Ethan quietly smiled because those words sounded remarkably familiar. Caroline's kindness had not ended with one young college student decades earlier. It had quietly continued through her daughter, reaching another generation without demanding recognition, repayment, or applause. In that simple moment, Ethan realized the greatest inheritance Caroline Bennett had ever left behind was never the ring itself. It was the courage to believe that hope becomes strongest when ordinary people choose to pass it forward. Nearly 1 year after Grace walked into Montgomery Holdings carrying a lost ring, the scholarship inspired by Caroline Bennett had quietly become one of the most respected community programs in Boston. It never appeared in flashy advertisements, and Ethan intentionally refused to attach his own name to its success. Every announcement, every acceptance letter, and every graduation certificate carried only one simple title: the Caroline Bennett Opportunity Scholarship. Beneath it appeared a single sentence taken directly from the unfinished letter Grace had discovered inside the old wooden box. Let kindness become another beginning. Grace often visited the scholarship office after finishing her shifts at the bookstore cafe. She never introduced herself as the founder's daughter. Instead, she organized applications, welcomed nervous students, and listened patiently to stories that reminded her how easily hope could disappear when people believed no one noticed their struggles. She understood those feelings because she had once carried them herself without realizing how close her life stood to an unexpected turning point. One afternoon, a quiet young woman entered the office holding a worn backpack and a folder filled with carefully organized papers. She apologized several times before even sitting down, worried that her grades were not impressive enough. Grace smiled gently and offered her a cup of tea before saying, "Tell me about the person you hope to become, not only the grades you already earned." The young woman relaxed almost immediately. Ethan happened to pass the interview room a few minutes later. Through the glass wall, he watched Grace listening with complete attention instead of interrupting with questions. He smiled quietly because Caroline had once listened to him in exactly the same way. Compassion had become a tradition instead of a memory. Later that evening, after the applicants had gone home, Ethan invited Grace to the rooftop garden above the headquarters building. The city skyline glowed beneath the colors of the setting sun, while a gentle breeze carried the sounds of distant traffic through the evening air. Ethan opened a small velvet box and placed the familiar sapphire ring inside Grace's hands. She looked at him with immediate surprise. "I cannot accept this," she said softly. "It belongs to your family." Ethan nodded respectfully. "The ring will always remain part of my family's history, but I want you to keep it for one evening." Grace looked down at the sapphire reflecting the last light of day. "Why?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "Because your mother carried the burden of letting it go so someone else could keep moving forward. I think she deserves to have it come home one final time." Grace held the ring carefully, feeling as though she were touching a piece of history that had quietly connected two families without either one realizing it. The following morning, she returned the ring exactly as promised. Ethan accepted it with a grateful smile before placing it inside a glass display case located in the scholarship office rather than inside his private vault. Beside the ring rested Caroline's handwritten note, the original jewelry receipt, and a simple plaque explaining that one anonymous act of compassion had created opportunities for generations of students. Visitors often stopped to read the display, never focusing on the value of the jewelry itself. Instead, they stood quietly before the words of a woman who had believed that true wealth could never be measured by possessions alone. As Grace watched another group of scholarship recipients walk through the front doors with hopeful faces and carefully prepared dreams, she realized her mother had never disappeared into the past. Caroline Bennett continued walking beside every person courageous enough to choose kindness before recognition, generosity before reward, and hope before fear. 2 years passed, yet the story that began with a lost ring never truly ended. It simply continued through lives quietly changed by a single decision made without expecting recognition. Every spring, Montgomery Holdings welcomed a new group of scholarship recipients into the bright auditorium overlooking the Boston skyline. Some dreamed of becoming teachers. Others hoped to become engineers, nurses, architects, or entrepreneurs. Each carried different ambitions, but they all entered beneath the same words engraved across the entrance wall. Let kindness become another beginning. Grace stood near the registration table greeting every student with the same warm smile that had once welcomed nervous customers into the little bookstore cafe. She had completed her degree, continued working in community education, and volunteered countless hours mentoring scholarship recipients. She never introduced herself as the daughter of Caroline Bennett unless someone specifically asked. She believed her mother would have preferred actions over introductions. Ethan remained involved in every scholarship ceremony, but he always chose a seat among the audience rather than the center of attention. Success had taught him many lessons, yet none remained more important than the one Caroline unknowingly gave him decades earlier outside a neighborhood jewelry store. On the morning of the program's second anniversary, one scholarship recipient approached Grace after the ceremony carrying a small envelope. "I wanted you to have this," the young man said. "Because of this scholarship, I am the first person in my family to graduate from college. I cannot repay what everyone has done for me, but I can promise to help someone else someday." Grace accepted the handwritten letter with quiet gratitude before watching him walk toward his waiting family. She smiled because the words sounded wonderfully familiar. Later that afternoon, Grace and Ethan returned to the scholarship office where the sapphire ring remained displayed beside Caroline's handwritten note and the original jewelry receipt. Visitors continued stopping before the exhibit, not because they admired expensive jewelry, but because they found hope inside an ordinary story of honesty, sacrifice, and compassion. Grace looked at the display case before quietly saying, "I used to believe this ring was the most valuable thing my mother left behind." Ethan glanced toward her. "And now?" Grace smiled gently. "Now I know it was never the ring. It was the choice she made while wearing it." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. Objects can survive for generations. Decisions can survive forever. As evenings settled across Boston, the last visitors slowly left the building. Sunlight faded through the tall glass windows, casting warm reflections across the polished floor. Before locking the scholarship office, Grace paused beside the display one final time. She gently straightened the small plaque beneath the ring and quietly read the inscription that thousands of visitors had already seen. It simply thanked one woman who believed another person's future mattered as much as her own comfort. No titles, no grand achievements, no celebration of wealth, only gratitude. Walking toward the exit, Grace looked back once more before switching off the lights. The sapphire caught the final ray of sunlight and shimmered softly inside the quiet room, no longer representing something that had once been lost, but something that had finally found its true purpose. Ethan waited patiently by the front doors as they stepped outside into the cool evening air. Together, they watched students laughing across the campus courtyard, carrying books, backpacks, and dreams that would soon become futures of their own. Neither of them spoke because nothing more needed to be said. Some people leave behind fortunes. Others leave behind buildings with their names carved in stone. Caroline Bennett left behind something far greater. She proved that one honest choice, made without expecting anything in return, can quietly travel across generations until strangers become family through kindness, forgotten promises become living legacies, and hope continues.